Hi, everyone. Hope you are having or have had a great Memorial Day weekend. Welcome to the 5th episode of our new viral world, the drug debate. I know there has been a lot of talk in the last weeks about different treatments for COVID-19, whether or not they work or not, and whether they cause more harm than good. So I'm going to talk about some of the most commonly known treatments for COVID-19 and what the data is for whether they are effective treatments or not. So let's get started. Treatments for COVID-19 can often be separated into two categories: those that are targeting the virus and those that are targeting the host responses. The first treatment that I'll talk about today is a virus targeted, and it's called convalescent plasma. So this is often one of the first line treatments for viruses like COVID-19 that don't have any known treatments for them. And basically what we do here is we harness our own immune system. So people who have been exposed to COVID-19 will produce antibodies that likely will neutralize this virus. And as these people recover, they then have this kind of gold mine of antibodies that could help others in need. These people can then donate their blood after they've recovered completely from their infection. Within that blood are three main categories. So 55% of this blood is what we call plasma, and this contains antibodies, fluids, and some other proteins. 1% of the blood that's donated are white blood cells, or the immune cells of our system. And 44% of the blood that's donated are red blood cells. So those are the cells that kind of carry oxygen around to the other organs of our body. And so we can isolate just the plasma from these cells that have the antibodies that likely will neutralize the virus. And we can give that plasma like a blood transfusion to people who are infected with COVID-19 to help neutralize the virus and increase the amount of antibodies that can fight against COVID-19. So does it work? I'm going to highlight two studies that were done early on in the course of the pandemic, but there's many more down the pipeline. So the first was a case series of 5 severe COVID-19 patients. So all of these patients were on respirators. And of note, they were additionally on steroids and or a antiviral, but none of them were on remdesivir. And they received this convalescent plasma treatment transfusion 10 to 22 days after they were admitted to the hospital. And the researchers found that after the transfusion, there was a reduction in the viral load of these patients, as well as an increase in neutralizing antibody titers in their blood. And at the end of the study, they found that 3 of the patients were able to be discharged, so they had improved and were recovering, and 2 of the patients had stabilized. In another study that included 10 severe COVID-19 patients, all of whom received treatment an average of 16.5 days after symptom onset, they found that after convalescent plasma transfusion, 3 of the patients were able to be discharged at the end of the study, and 7 of the patients had improved and stabilized to the point that they were getting ready to be discharged. They then looked at 10 other patients that had similar symptomology to the 10 patients that they looked at with the convalescent plasma transfusion, but did not receive one, and found that 3 had unfortunately died, 1 had improved, and 6 had stabilized, showing that there may be a difference in outcomes in patients who received convalescent plasma transfusions. There are pros and cons to convalescent plasma treatment. The concept has been used previously. It was actually used during the original SARS outbreak, and they found that people who received these transfusions at least 2 weeks after symptom onset showed some improvements. So some safety and efficacy data has been shown, and it can potentially be used as a prophylactic, meaning that it could be used prior to being infected with COVID-19 to prevent infection. And it's thought that these antibodies actually work better earlier on in the course of illness. However, this concept and this treatment is often hard to scale up. So, of course, we need enough people who have previously been infected with COVID-19 and have mounted an appropriate immune response. Of those people, they have to be eligible to donate blood and willing to donate that blood. And additionally, that blood then has to be screened before any transfusion is done. Each donor who gives blood can typically donate around 2 to 3 units of plasma. And the treatment for COVID-19 has included 1 to 2 transfusions of convalescent plasma. So this is a fairly good ratio. You can see that one donor may be able to donate enough blood to treat 2 patients. However, there have been some advancements in the use of convalescent plasma into the development of human immunoglobulin, or what I'll call convalescent plasma 2.0. And here they use a patient's plasma as the starting ingredient. They then purify this plasma and remove a lot of the fluids and other proteins that may be in that portion of the blood, so that we're giving people a more concentrated and potentially more potent and reliable treatment. Some of the institutes that have been focused on developing convalescent plasma 2.0 believe that they could have this on the market between 9 to 18 months. However, many of these institutes are now creating consortiums to help push these efforts forward. So another interesting and I think fascinating technology that's being used to help produce more COVID-19 antibodies is the idea of recombinant antibody production. So here they would take B cells from people who have recovered from COVID-19 and stimulate them so that they would start to produce antibodies that would neutralize COVID-19. So imagine there's many other different types of cells here that are producing many other antibodies, but all of them neutralize COVID-19. They then find out the sequence of these antibodies, the DNA sequence that produces these antibodies. And they put that DNA sequence in what we call a cell culture model. So basically, these cells are going to be antibody-making machines, all of which have a DNA sequence to antibodies that neutralize COVID-19. And they will just churn out all these antibodies, and they can then take those antibodies and use them as treatment for people who are infected. As I mentioned, there are several consortium that have been created, both in the US and abroad, to expand access to convalescent plasma treatment, as well as recruit those who have recovered from COVID-19 to be donors. The Convalescent Plasma Program is one that's been created in the US in association with the FDA and being led by the Mayo Clinic. And there are currently 40 institutes that are collecting plasma throughout the US. Additionally, there is a clinical trial being run to evaluate the efficacy and safety of convalescent plasma for treatment of COVID-19. And that now includes over 2,000 sites. It's registered almost 8,000 patients, and almost 4,000 of those have now undergone convalescent plasma transfusion. And it's thought that at least 70% of those who have recovered may be suitable donors. So this is really an opportunity for those who have been exposed to COVID-19 and have antibodies to it to improve outcomes for those who are coming later, in a potential second wave as things begin to open up. Next, I'll talk about some of the drug treatments that you may have heard a little bit more about. Remdesivir is an antiviral treatment that inhibits the replication of COVID-19 in cells. And the study of remdesivir for COVID-19 was called the ACT-1 trial, or the Adaptive COVID-19 Treatment Trial. This trial was initially started in late February and enrolled over 1,000 patients. And interestingly, actually, one of the first patients to be enrolled in this study was an American who had been on the Diamond Princess cruise ship that had an outbreak of over 800 patients. The preliminary results from the ACT-1 trial showed that there was a statistically significant improvement in recovery time for those who were treated with remdesivir versus placebo. So those in the treatment group recovered in 11 days, and those in the placebo group recovered in 15 days. However, I think we're all very interested to understand if remdesivir can really prevent death. Does this drug actually have a survival benefit? And what they found in this trial is that those who were treated with remdesivir had a mortality rate of 8%, and those who were in the placebo group had a mortality rate of 11.6. And this was not a statistically significant improvement in mortality rate. And we base that off of a statistical equation that gives us a p-value. And when a p-value is greater than 0.5, it's considered not significant. And if it's lower than 0.5, it's considered significant. So here you can see that the p-value for the survival benefit was 0.059. So likely a trend towards a survival benefit. However, after April 28th, the decision was made by the Act 1 trial groups to begin to give remdesivir to those patients who initially received placebo treatment, which means we likely won't get any more information about mortality benefit from this specific study. And there's been a lot of discussion about that decision. However, I feel as though the trial creators felt ethically they needed to give this treatment to everyone once they began to see some benefit. There are several other trials that are being run to look at remdesivir. There's one out of the University of Chicago that's shown some initial good outcomes. However, there's another that was coming out of China that showed no benefit. So I think the jury is really out about whether or not remdesivir has a survival benefit. However, the FDA has approved remdesivir for emergency use in the US, and Japan has approved remdesivir for severe COVID treatment as of early May. And the last virus-targeted treatment I'll talk about today is chloroquine, which has had a lot of controversial press recently about its ability to treat COVID-19. So the initial ideas here is that chloroquine prevents viral entry into the cells. And there were some initial studies that showed that chloroquine treatment of COVID-19 infected patients led to shortened recovery times, reduced viral titers, and a resolution in pneumonia. That was chloroquine alone, as well as chloroquine with an antibiotic called azithromycin. There's a recent article that came out in The Lancet that showed some different outcomes with chloroquine treatment for COVID-19. And I think this really highlights the importance of really having as much efficacy and safety data as possible before recommending a treatment. So this study included over 14,000 people that were in the treatment groups. And what they found is that those who were treated with chloroquine, hydroxychloroquine, or a combination of chloroquine and antibiotics such as azithromycin, there is an increased risk of death in those who were treated with chloroquine. Additionally, they also found that other comorbidities that we know are risk factors for severe disease, such as previous heart disease or lung disease, also predispose those to death. They also found that there was an increased risk of ventricular arrhythmia, or an irregular heart rate, in those who were treated with chloroquine. And this is something that the FDA had warned about some time ago, that chloroquine should not be used as a treatment, not under a doctor's care, because there was an increased risk of irregular heart rate. So I think there's going to be a lot of discussion after this paper came out about whether or not chloroquine should really be a recommended treatment for COVID-19 if there is a increased mortality rate for those who are treated with it. Next, I'll talk about a potential host-targeted treatment for COVID-19, which is the use of interferons. So in the setting of a viral infection, such as COVID-19, the virus will enter into the body and then enter into cells. But these cells can see the virus and they want to fight back. And so they create an antiviral response. And part of this antiviral response is the release of interferons. And the release of these interferons leads to an increase in proteins that can fight off the virus. So it leads to a reduction in the viral burden, but it also recruits a lot of immune cells. And those cells start to secrete proteins that are very inflammatory. And these inflammatory proteins are thought to lead to some of the lung damage that's being seen in COVID-19, that's causing people to be put on respirators and be unable to breathe. And part of the issue with the type 1 interferons is that these interferons are expressed all over the body in all different types of cells. The idea behind interferon lambda is that these type 3 interferons are expressed on only a subset of cells. So only on epithelial cells and some immune cells. So they could have a more directed action against the virus. So once the virus infects these cells, yes, it has an antiviral response, and that reduces viral burden, but the amount of inflammation is really muted, preventing the type of lung damage that we're seeing with COVID-19. So this is something that's still in the pipeline that people have been discussing more, but an interesting approach and something that may be able to be combined with other treatments to prevent severe disease. And the last more exploratory host-targeted treatment I'll talk about today is the use of receptor inhibitors to prevent cytokine storm. So as I mentioned before, when people are infected with COVID-19, that leads to an infection in the lung, causing a pneumonia. And this increase in inflammation can kind of be like a snowball effect, where inflammation increases and increases, that leads to lung damage and hyperinflammation, causing acute respiratory distress syndrome and organ failure. And so the idea here is, how can we inhibit the inflammatory response that's being triggered in the lungs? And what some studies have shown is that there's a specific inflammatory protein, and that is called IL-6, that is much higher in severe COVID patients than in mild COVID patients. So the question is, can we inhibit IL-6 protein? So there are several inhibitors for IL-6. One of them is called tocilizumab. And this is a monoclonal antibody that inhibits the IL-6 receptor, so it's unable to bind to it. There have been some initial studies looking at the effects of this antibody on COVID-19, and they've mostly been mixed. It's also a very expensive treatment, and it may require multiple doses. So I think the jury is still out about whether or not this would be a feasible treatment for COVID-19. The other inhibitor for cytokine storm and for IL-6 production is the use of an alpha-1 adrenergic receptor antagonist. So it's kind of in the same realm, where it's inhibiting the production of this inflammatory cytokine that we know is higher at an increased abundance in severe COVID patients. These studies are still being developed. So I think it's an interesting concept to try to prevent the host immune response that may be out of control, but we're still learning about how efficacious these treatments may be. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch today, and please subscribe below if you're interested in hearing more content. My next episode will be focused on the decisions that many places have made to reopen and what the impacts may be on our communities. If you have any questions about what I've talked about today regarding therapeutics for COVID-19, please leave them below. Thanks.